So good evening, everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Courtney Winter-Peters and I am the CEO of Stand Up. To start the evening, as we are standing here on Bunurong land, it is my honour to introduce Professor Caroline Briggs to welcome us to country. Professor Briggs is a Yalukut, Willem and Bunurong elder.
Good evening. I'd like to pay my respects to you and being a part of this stand-up for our Jewish Community Council of Victoria. My name is Naui Caroline Briggs and it's an honour to be here tonight to be with you. So Wamajika, Marambik Bik Bunurong, Namde Buruptan Ata Willem. Come with a purpose to our beautiful home. And as one of the descendants of the first peoples of the Bunurong of the Greater Kulin Nation, I'm pleased to welcome you all here tonight. I believe it is important for all Australians to understand and appreciate the cultures of our first peoples of Melbourne. This is the traditional country of the Yalukut Willem of the Bunurong language group. We were one of the 5 language groups who made up the larger nation as the Kulin. At the time of the first European settlement, this area was occupied by the Yalukut Willem clan of the Bunurong. It is now over 180 years since the Europeans first entered our country and came up our sacred river called the Birrarung and flowed out into our great bay known as Naram. And what we've learnt from our ancestors' achievements still resonates with us. This includes the core values of learning, Yileng, showing respect, Dilbruk, celebrating life, and honouring sacred ground. This importance of learning we have always valued the commitment of learning and has been part of every generation since time began. And it's one of the reasons why we are still strong today. Showing respect, or Dilbruk, we respect our traditional laws and customs, but we also accept the different ways of the Europeans. This is the same way we show respects to our cultures, our religious or our spiritual beliefs today. And we are here to celebrate. And we must remember the celebration of life, the arrival of new children, the coming of the seasons, the visiting of the clans was very much an important part of our traditional life. And today we support the celebration of modern Indigenous arts and cultures. This was our ancestors' legacies. Respecting sacred ground, or what we call Mother Earth, Pavanata. We should all acknowledge the sacred ground on which we stand. And today we are host to many people from many different nations and countries, and we still call upon them to respect sacred ground and the history and the culture of our country. The struggles to preserve our cultures and traditions began with our ancestors in the 1830s. And one of the most important lessons we should take from that struggle was the way we forged an alliance that led to many of the achievements that we have sometimes take for granted today. While we may have descended from different clans and language groups, our grandparents and our great-grandparents worked together to achieve the outcomes that we can all celebrate. And they're the most important things we have learnt from our past. And today it is my hope that we can all take pride in the shared history and celebrate the strength of our great nations. And according to our traditions, our lands will always be protected by our Creator, Bunjil, who travels as an eagle, and by Wan, who protects our waterway, travels as a crow. Bunjil taught us to always welcome guests. But he required us to ask all guests to make a number of commitments. To obey the laws of Bunjil or the Wurrungi Big, not to harm our lands and waters, and particularly not harm Bunjil's children. And this commitment is made through an exchange of a small vow dipped in the water of the land. So once again, Womanjika, Marambik Bik Bunurong, Namder, Barupton, Arta Willam. Come with a purpose. Our purpose tonight is to celebrate and hear the stories about what we want to share with you about why it's important to be recognised in the Constitution. So it's up to you how you will perceive that knowledge, because it's been a long struggle. We are the first peoples of this land, this continent, and we want to be able to celebrate it and create stronger voices for our communities across this continent. Thank you. Nungujin.
Thank you, Professor Briggs. We are certainly all here with a purpose tonight. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? That's it. That is the one question we will be asked later this year. Welcome to the launch of Call Halev. Call Halev with a whole heart. It's a campaign to educate, advocate and unite Jewish people nationally behind a yes vote. Stand Up proudly launched this campaign with JCCV just over a month ago. Their banner was meant to be proudly next to us, but we had a bit of a mishap, so I apologise. The name, Kol Halev, has links to the Uluru Statement of the Heart, but it also recognised that we are being asked to listen with our whole heart, an open heart. Shortly, I will pass over to our moderator, Rabbi Ralph Genende, who will introduce our esteemed panel of guests. Rabbi Ralph, Senior Rabbi of Jewish Care and Kehilat Kesher, is not just a community leader, but he has been a staunch advocate for reconciliation and understanding between the Jewish community and the First Peoples of Australia. On Friday, Prime Minister Albanese spoke at the Australian Israel Chamber of Commerce lunch and acknowledged Stand Up, as well as our partners JCCV and B'nai B'rith, as well as the ARC Centre, together with Rabbi Ralph, who he quoted directly for being leaders in our community and supporting a yes. Shortly, we will hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Marcia Langton, a powerful advocate who you will hear more about from Rabbi Ralph. We will then be guided by our moderator through a Q&A. Whilst we won't have time for audience questions, I apologise, we are in the trustworthy hands of Rabbi Ralph, who has prepared a range of questions to guide us and enlighten us. We know many of you have questions, and our speakers have kindly offered to hang around for half an hour or so after the panel if you want to chat. Recently, in an article for Kehilat Kesher, Rabbi Ralph reflected on the rabbinical statement that words that come from the heart enter directly into the heart. He went on to say, words composed in the still of an aching heart connect instantly to the heart of another, especially another who has travelled the path of an anguished heart. We ourselves have travelled the path of an anguished heart, and now is our time for listening, connecting, and doing. In deciding whether or not to support a yes in the upcoming referendum, at Stand Up we look towards our values. We looked inward to our Jewish values and outward to our partners and what it means to be an ally. We remembered, as always, that we are driven by both ancient and contemporary Jewish calls to pursue social justice. We will not be bystanders to systems that have entrenched disadvantage. We know the harms this can do. As for allyship, what does that mean? Right now, it means walking side by side on the path to reconciliation, no matter how long it takes. It means training ourselves, educating ourselves, listening to the voices of the people that this affects the most, being partners, listeners, and change makers. It means being brave and having the courage to spark up conversations with those around you. Our hope is that tonight, with this lineup of speakers, we will empower you with knowledge for those very conversations. and hopefully we'll even inspire you to get active. Call Halev is a communal campaign. It's our time to show the First Peoples of this country, the country that has given us home, safety and a place to thrive, that we see them and we hear them. I also want to thank the other Jewish organisations that have joined the Call Halev team as partners. Daniel Agion, president of JCCV and our founding partner, rightly said that now is the time to show leadership. To the National Council of Jewish Women, the national body, the Victorian body and the New South Wales body, or just Jewish Youth for Yes, Plus 61J, B'nai B'rith, Shalom College, Kehilat Koleno and the Sydney Jewish Museum, we thank you for being early collaborators and setting an example. You understood the call from Call Halev and we thank you for your leadership. You'll hear more about our plans after the panel when our brilliant team, Campaign Manager Hannah Hammerschlag and Campaign Chair Mickey Fisher, jump up to give you a quick overview on how you can get involved. In handing over to Rabbi Ralph for the night, I want to remind you of our anguished hearts. Our anguished hearts that have known loss and devastation as much as we have known survival and resilience. As a Jewish community, we are vocal about what matters to us. We are not afraid to make a noise when our livelihood and our freedom of expression is threatened. We do not rest at a spark of anti-Semitism and we know what it takes for us to thrive. We have a voice and it is loud and proud. Now is our time to heed the call of the First Peoples of Australia and stand side by side on the path to reconciliation and towards a yes in the upcoming referendum. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Courtney, for setting the tone so powerfully, eloquently, and feelingly for the evening. Kol hakavod. The voice echoes over the waters, over the mighty waters. The voice is in the power. The voice is in the beauty. It breaks the grand cedars. It creates flames of fire, and it makes the outback quake. I've taken and adapted these words straight out of the book of Psalms, Psalm 29. We, the Jewish people, stood at the base of a sacred rock in the wilderness desert of Sinai some 3,500 years ago, and there the voice of God proclaimed a moral code, proudly asserted that freedom belongs to all of us, to all of humanity, but that we all have our different voices. In my bones and in my blood runs and connects me so naturally, I feel, and intimately to our First People of Australia. The Uluru Statement from the Heart speaks directly to my Jewish heart in the spirit of that rabbinical statement that Courtney just mentioned, that Dvarim hayotzim min halev nichnasim lalev, words that come from the heart, enter directly into the heart. The statement, the voice, it's as brief as it is powerful. It's a collective cry from the heart of our Aboriginal people. And we are people who have been burdened by the exclusion and powerlessness, perhaps more than any other group can identify with that evocative, that anguished phrase from the Uluru Statement, the torment of our powerlessness. A yes vote is a response to the call for recognition, for representation, a place in the choir of our country, a first step in the respect for those who have walked and who have dreamt in this ancient country for countless centuries. Marcia is a formidable leader with a fierce intellect, anthropologist, geographer, academic, writer, public intellectual. She's held numerous important positions and foundation chair and provost of the Australian Indigenous Studies at Melbourne University. And she's received countless accolades and awards. It's not an easy task to lead your people through the wilderness and through the wounding world of academia and of politics. Professor Langton does it with strength, a passionate conviction, and it really is my privilege to welcome her tonight on behalf of the Kol Hakavod to Kol Halev campaign, on behalf of Stand Up and JCCV, to address us and I welcome you, b'chol libi, with my whole heart, to this gathering tonight. Marcia.
Thank you, Nawit, Auntie Caroline, Professor Caroline Briggs, for your elegant welcome to country. I've lived on your country for a long time now, and I acknowledge your leadership and our friendship, and thank you very much for all that you've done for me, and especially in welcoming me and so many people that I know to feel that, you know, we have a stake in the future of your country by treating your country properly and your people properly. So thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Ralph, for your very warm welcome. I won't speak for long, but I do hope that at some point this evening we could have somebody read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So I want to tell you a little about the history of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The story goes back at least 30 years. Now, some of you may have read a beautiful essay by Senator Patrick Dodson in the Monthly, in the latest issue of the Monthly. Senator Patrick Dodson was the very first chair of the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council, established in the early 2000s following the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And the establishment of the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council was a recommendation of the Royal Commission because it was the view of the commissioners, the national commissioners, that only a process of reconciliation could stop the dreadful toll of incarceration, imprisonment, arrest, and for too many, deaths in custody. And so they devised, and Senator Dodson was at that time a commissioner on the Royal Commission, so they devised a reconciliation process, and the government implemented that recommendation of the 336. Very few others have been implemented, and now we're up over 500 deaths in custody since that report. So Patrick chaired the Reconciliation Council for the 10 years of its life. The statute allowed for 10 years, and there were 3 councils. I was a member of the middle one. The last one presented a comprehensive report to the then Prime Minister, John Howard, at a meeting called Corroboree 2000. And it called for a pathway to constitutional reform to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it also called for a number of other things, including an apology to the stolen generations. It was entirely rejected by Prime Minister John Howard, and it was another 8 years before there was an apology to the stolen generations when Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister. So I want you to think about that apology, because there's a great deal of naysaying and terrible predictions about what will happen if the referendum succeeds and there's recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples through the establishment of a voice. My memory of the apology was that it healed hearts. It was a great healing gesture for the survivors of the stolen generations themselves, who turned up in their hundreds at Parliament House that day to hear the apology. But it was also heard by Australians all over the country and all around the world. And we know that has put our hearts to rest about the terrible crimes committed against all those children who were forcibly removed from their families. And I want to remind you that in Western Australia, The two human rights inquirers appointed by the Commission to conduct the inquiry into stolen generations looked at the historical record in Western Australia, and they came to the conclusion that the historical records show that the forced removal of Aboriginal children in Western Australia fitted the article in the Convention on Genocide, and that what had happened in Western Australia was in fact an act of genocide. The historical records were not so clear for the other states or colonies, but I believe in time historians will uncover those records, and we will see across the country that the many hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were at the very least subjected to invasion, suppression, dispossession, theft of their children, impoverishment and marginalisation. After Patrick Dodson led the Reconciliation Council, people of goodwill said we must not let this process end, and so they formed Reconciliation Australia. And all around the country there are reconciliation groups, and many companies, institutions, schools, universities have reconciliation action plans. And we know the good that they do. We know that they bring our communities together, and we know that they have good outcomes. I do believe that the people on the No case have no respect for that history of Australians overcoming the crimes of the past by acts of goodwill such as acts of reconciliation, reconciliation action plans, the celebration of NAIDOC, and so many other acts that go unnoticed by the media. Yesterday, the ABC reported from a little town east of Perth, York, where 160 years ago, a white settler shot an Aboriginal man who was armed with a spear and was allegedly trying to steal a sheep. The man died, his spear fell to the ground. The settler took the spear, and the family remains in that station to this day, and the spear was kept in their home. A descendant of that settler took the spear out of the roof and found the descendant of Tommy Tracker, who was murdered, and presented her with the spear. I encourage you to read the article because Marion Kickett and the young woman from that station family found a way to reconcile over that terrible history and to join together in an act of reconciliation. The Uluru Statement from the Heart provides us with the answer to this question that has been asked since the war began here over 180 years ago, and in many parts of the country in periods less, because the invaders didn't reach North Australia in many cases until the 1920s. I'm a descendant of a group of people called the Yiman. My grandfather was a Yiman man, and they were massacred in their hundreds for decades. So we know our history. A couple of books have been written, but it's always about how the poor settlers were harried and harassed by the natives. Well, the story is much darker, much more brutal, and one day the truth will be told. We know that the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for voice, treaty, truth, and in that order because we have been subjected to a political strategy since 1901 where political parties use various tactics to frighten the electorate into voting a certain way. And for some decades, the favourite strategy is to frighten the voters into believing that we, the Aborigines, are somehow a threat to Australian society or to the Australian economy or to democracy. We're somewhere between 3 and 4% of the population. We have barely survived the invasion, and most of our population are living on the margins. Over a third of our population are the poorest people in Australia. So how is it that we are a threat to Australia, and how is it that by giving us recognition through an advisory body, a body that would advise Parliament and the executive government, that we are a threat to democracy? It's a nonsense. We're not a threat. In fact, I urge you to read the Australian Constitution, and I urge you to read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. There's a few other things you could read, but if you read those two documents, you'll see what's intended, and this is what is intended. The Australian Constitution is an act of the British Parliament in Westminster. It became effective on January 1, 1901. It united the colonies, and it is entirely British. Now, so many years later, Australia is a very different place. There's your community and other communities like yours who came at various times in Australian history who are not descendants of the British. I mean, I'm sure some of you are, descendants of the East London Jewry. In fact, there was a Jewish boy on the First Fleet. So, and many Jewish people in our history. But there are many other groups who came to this country. And so now, whereas in 1901, the settlers were still a minority because they hadn't got to the north and got out of New South Wales and Victoria into the north to lay waste to the northern populations. So a majority of settlers in New South Wales and Victoria, but still a minority in the other colonies, or by 1901 states. And then in the 1950s, a majority of British descendants, but now Australians of non-British descent are in the majority, about 52%. We, however, have gone from 1788 on the 25th of January to 100% of the population to now between 3 and 4%. We're asking simply for recognition and a constitutional right to have an advisory body to advise Parliament as the mechanism of recognising us whose ancestors came here 65,000 years ago, according to archaeologists. So what would this achieve? This will enrich the Constitution so that it's not simply a British document to unite the colonies, but a constitution that more reflects the Australia that we live in today. It does not in any way take away your rights or anybody else's rights. It doesn't give us more right than you. It doesn't make our vote worth more than yours. It merely allows us to have a mechanism to give some advice through a representative body on matters that affect only us. Now, there's a lot of scaremongering about that. What if the Voice gives advice on the Australian Defence Force? There was a terrific article in The Guardian by a former SAS officer who said, good, I hope they do, because the modern ADF must learn the lesson of what happened in Afghanistan, where all of the invading nations retreated in the face of the Taliban because the Indigenous people there held sway. Now, what did they learn from that? That Indigenous knowledge is important. So the Australian ADF, this SAS officer says, must learn from Australian Indigenous knowledge, because the defence of Australia will become very important in the future because of our vast continent, where still the majority in the north, a majority in the north, usually about 30% of the population, remains Indigenous. They live on the country. They live in the remote parts of Australia where no white people live. They're the eyes and ears for the northern coastlines and territories. This is why the ADF works with Aboriginal people. So the people who are saying this Voice will pose a threat to the ADF have no idea how the ADF operates. There are at least 2 black battalions in the north, North Force and the 51st Battalion. It astonishes me that our politicians know so little about their own country. I've worked with both North Force and the 51st Battalion as a civilian, and bless them, most of them are black. And, you know, we'd be lost without them. So it's a nonsense that the Voice would give advice on interest rates and the Reserve Bank or franking credits. So, you know, that's not what Aboriginal people are concerned about. What we're concerned about is what so many Aboriginal leaders have talked about, such as the land councils in the Northern Territory. Food security, housing, and, you know, the ability of families to live safely and securely. The Maru in the Western Desert are in favour of the Voice, and they were reported in The Guardian on the weekend saying that they'd read the report by Tom Calmer and myself, the Calmer-Langton report, and they note that we recommended 5 additional seats on the National Voice for remote areas in acknowledgement of their dire circumstances. So all of us who have been involved in one way or another through the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the National Convention in Uluru and the Voice co-design and many years of campaigning for constitutional recognition want merely to be able to stop governments from causing us harm by imposing policies that exclude us, marginalise us and make our situation worse. Now, I'm fine. I live in Melbourne, and so many Indigenous people who live in Melbourne, not everyone, but so many, live much like you. I mean, I don't inherit money. My entire family was dispossessed. Most of them were killed. But, you know, I've made my way in life, and so many Indigenous people can say that and live a relatively good life. But we're a tiny minority. We're the first generation who made it through the system of racism that I grew up in. We're kind of, you know, living with survivor guilt, and I know so many of you know what that is about. We can't enjoy life without bringing the rest of our people with us. Our peoples, the Maru, the Aranda, the Warlpiri, the Yolngu, all of the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who want to survive, who want to pass on their cultures, who want to be recognised by Australians, part of the Australian economy and society on their own terms. But government after government have stopped innovations, improvements, and the Closing the Gap reports every year tell us that we're barely succeeding on 2 indicators, and that on most we're failing to meet the targets. We cannot keep doing what is failing. We must bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into the governmental mechanism in Parliament and in the executive government to give advice to stop ridiculous policies being imposed from Canberra through the funding to the state governments and the territory governments and onto Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people with no regard for what they think will work. I encourage all of you to meet Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Get out beyond the Great Dividing Range and go to communities and see the actual circumstances. When you do, just say you went to Kununurra, a township in the East Kimberley, or Kathrine, another township in the Northern Territory, or some remote communities like Purnu in the Western Desert, you will see the extreme poverty of Aboriginal people, the overcrowding, the unemployment. It is very, very obvious. And then you will realise that what has been said to you by the no case and by certain elements in the media are just simply lies. And they are defending a particular set of interests who do not want to see us succeed. That, like the fantasy that we shouldn't give advice on the hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women who work in the ADF and bring great value to the Australian Defence Force, they have this fantasy that we're somehow going to stop mining by having a voice. It's a nonsense. There are hundreds of Indigenous land use agreements negotiated under the Native Title Act. There are Australian laws about native title, about mining, about how you go about it. The voice cannot interfere in any of that. It can only give advice. So there are people in the no case who are paid by elements of the mining industry, particularly the minnows, the people who put exploration tenements all over the country and then sell them to the highest bidder and churn exploration tenements. They're the kind of people who don't care about our country. They don't care about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they don't care about the environment. They don't care about the future of Australia. Most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, over 80%, support the referendum question, support the voice, support voice treaty truth, and want peace with Australians and cooperation, collaboration, partnership. That's what the Reconciliation Action Plans have been doing for 20 years. Now we want a Reconciliation Action Plan at a national level. I think it's very simple and straightforward. Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through establishing the voice as an advisory body to make representations to Parliament and the executive government. It couldn't be more straightforward. And I know that your community would understand that this is actually the least that we could ask for. There are no treaties. There's no parliament such as the Sami have, a Sami parliament. There's no right, as in the Canadian Constitution, to be consulted. We have nothing. We're not recognised in the Constitution. And I know that's not the Australia that you want to live in. You want to live in an Australia where the First Peoples are recognised, where everybody has an honourable place in the country. The history of this country, and it's not your fault, but the history of this country has left us outside of the constitutional framework in weird ways and ridiculously complicated to explain here. But I urge you to do the reading. I urge you to think about your vote. Each one of us has a vote. I have one vote. You each have one vote. Think about what you will feel the day or the week after the referendum if the vote is no? If the overwhelming number of Australians vote no, is that the kind of Australia you want to live in? I know how you feel about your community being accepted in Australia, and I've been to Israel 3 times. I understand the problems. We have the opportunity here to go about this simple change in a democratic and peaceful manner. It will resolve so much, just as the apology did. So I thank you for inviting me here tonight. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Marcia. You probably don't have a Hebrew name, but if I did give you one, I'd call you Miriam, who was the great leader of the Jewish people in the wilderness, who led her people and was always considered a source of nurture, water, and refinement and education to them. We have a wonderful panel tonight to accompany Marcia. Jamil Tai is a proud Yorta Bunurong man, and who has been integral to the Aboriginal activism movement throughout Australia, Victoria rather, from his family from the 1880s to the present day. And when you listen to, and I'm going to introduce Jamil and then Dr. Todd Fernando, you will hear from them. These are people who are connected to family, community, connection to land, respect for diversity, dignity of difference that is important to all of us. I think it's reflected in the kind of people they are. Jamil is a geologist. He did work in the Pilbara. He's also has a Master's of Teaching. And he has worked for which he combined with his studies of employment at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he's designed, developed, and delivered programs and initiatives to improve the health and the well-being of Aboriginal Victorians. He is passionate about providing Indigenous students with educational opportunities that will enable them to be successful graduates and leaders, future leaders in their chosen fields of study. Jamil is accompanied by Dr. Todd Fernando, descendant of the Kalari people of the Wiradjuri Nation. And Todd is the Victorian Commissioner for LGBTIQ+ communities. He provides a high level of strategic advice to the Victorian government on the development, implementation of policies, services, programs to meet the needs of the LGBTIQ+ communities. He has also completed his PhD in medical anthropology at the Uni of Melbourne and is recognised as a strategic thought leader in Australia. So I think we are really privileged to have accompanying, of course, Marcia, these 2 fine speakers who reflect the issues that we are discussing tonight, who have a voice to say about it, and a voice bringing from their experience, from their families, from their communities. We indeed welcome you. Please come up to the stage. And Marcia suggested a few moments ago that it's important for us to hear the voice. And our 2 panelists are going to actually read to us that powerful and evocative statement.
Hello, there we go. Perfect. Good evening, everyone. Just before I do start reading the Uluru Statement, I'd like to acknowledge Auntie Carolyn Briggs, my auntie, for providing us with the welcome to country. It's a real privilege to have Aunt welcome us, and so thank you for your attendance, Aunt. Jamil Tai, Yorta Bunurong. I'll read the first half and then I'll hand over to my brother Todd to read the rest. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart reads as this. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent lands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we're the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness.
We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take our rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to the country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations enshrined voice in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across the country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
Thank you. I think to start off with, if I could address the first question to you, Marcia, as the co-chair of the Indigenous Voice Co-Design Groups, you co-authored the report that lays out how a national voice model will operate. So based on this, can we expect to see in the structure or the formation of the Voice to Parliament details like, how many members are going to be chosen to represent the diverse regional, national Indigenous interests?
So, thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Rabbi. So, there were 52 people on the Voice Co-Design committees or groups. Professor Tom Culmer and myself were the chairs of the Senior Advisory Group. There was a National Voice Co-Design Group, in addition to the Senior Advisory Group, and a Local and Regional Voice Advisory Group. We consulted thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Australians, and we produced an interim report that was delivered from us by Minister Ken Wyatt, as he was then, first Aboriginal man in Parliament, the first Aboriginal Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and he was in the Scott Morrison cabinet along with Peter Dutton, and they allowed the interim report to be distributed to all Australians, and when Peter Dutton says that he hasn't seen the detail, there's one instance where he did as a cabinet member. We took the interim report out to thousands of Australians, took their advice, refined it, and developed the final report, and that too went to the cabinet of Scott Morrison, taken by Ken Wyatt from our Voice Co-Design group. Again, Peter Dutton saw that, and then it was released to the public. It's available online. Just Google Voice Co-Design final report. we recommended up to 35 regional or local voice bodies to be designed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, in many parts of Australia, such bodies already exist. So in Victoria, it's highly likely that, for instance, the First People's Assembly, which is established under Victorian law to negotiate a treaty, would be the voice in Victoria. In South Australia, the South Australian government has legislated the South Australian voice, but unfortunately just on the weekend or the end of last week, delayed the elections for the South Australian voice so as not to confuse people when the referendum comes up. The Torres Strait peoples have their own regional authority, and it's been in place for over 40 years as a result of the border treaty with New Guinea. So when Australia negotiated its border and settled through a treaty the border between Australia and Papua New Guinea, they also settled the matter of the Torres Strait Islanders, who are Melanesian peoples who've lived in Australia for 20,000 years in the archipelago of the Torres Straits, and established the Torres Strait Regional Authority, which is an elected body, and it operates in conjunction with alongside the Torres Strait Shire Council. And it is, subject to Queensland laws and federal laws. And they also have their own island councils. We have other bodies, the ACT Indigenous Elected Assembly, and that was legislated some years ago and has been operating for many years, and gives advice to the ACT Assembly, the Legislative Assembly. Other parts of Australia are going to find it more difficult and will take time, and we acknowledge that in the report and advised on a process for assisting, say, the Western Desert peoples to set up their voice, or Central Australian peoples to set up their voice, or the people in Arnhem Land to set up their voice over a period of time, and, acknowledging their rights to self-determination to determine how they wanted to do it. So we recognise that, some people don't like elections and they'd rather do it the customary way by having meetings. And so we said you could do it that way. We called it a structured process where Aboriginal people would structure meetings. And also we acknowledge that some people prefer elections because of their circumstances, such as in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, or in Tasmania, where people said that they would prefer elections. So according to the principle of self-determination, we said, fine, that's what you should do. So we made those recommendations. Then the states and territories would, the regional voices would nominate 2 from the big states, 2 representatives to the voice, 1 from the ACT and 1 from Tasmania because of population sizes. But we allowed for 5 extra seats for people from remote areas in acknowledgement of their dire circumstances and how much worse off they are than everybody else in Australia. And I was pleased to see that the Māori people saw that in our report and think that's a good idea because they are the poorest of the poor. And very rarely have a good relationship with government because they're so remote. Then we also insisted that Torres Strait Islanders have 1 or 2 seats on the national body, in addition to the Torres Strait Island representatives, because there's about 26,000 Torres Strait Islanders, or possibly more, who don't live in the islands but live on the mainland, and nobody represents them. So we wanted them to be represented. We're also mindful that most of our population is young. Over 60% of our population is under the age of 25. So we want we recommended a permanent advisory body made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth to advise the National Voice, and that's because they, if they're under 18, they can't serve on a government body, but they could be on an advisory body. 1 in 4 of our people live with a disability, so we recommended a permanent advisory body of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live with disabilities to give advice. And we also allowed for extra seats or expert advisors so that particular issues could be dealt with at a national policy level. So that's a quick rundown, but just in terms of how the advice would be given, we recommended that a committee in Parliament be established, like the Bill Scrutiny Committee, which sees all bills and gives advice on them before they go through the House and the Senate. So, and there's also a Human Rights Committee that does the same work. So we wanted a committee established alongside them to receive the written advice of the National Voice on legislation on matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also that the Voice receive requests from government to give advice in development of policy or, without being asked, give advice on policies that are being developed that would affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Well, Marcia, I hope you're not going to give us a test on what you've just said, because it obviously reflects just the incredible amount of work and thought that has gone into the process, as well as the fact that it is also incredibly representative of people right across the country from all kinds of places. I think that's something which is not necessarily well known, and so thank you for sharing that. I'd like to sort of change a little bit and turn to you, Jamil, and your great-grandfather, if I pronounced it correctly, Shadrach Livingston James, William Cooper relative. He was one of the first Aboriginal people to call First Nations representation in Parliament. So why do you think it was important to him? And why is the voice of Parliament important to you in 2023?
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes, he was. So his father was a man by the name of Thomas Shadrach James, who was actually Indian Mauritian man that came to Australia in the late 1800s and met the Aboriginal people from Maloga Mission and later Cummeragunja Mission, actually not far from here on the beach at Brighton. He agreed to take up a teaching position there and sort of, I guess, taught the first wave of Aboriginal activists that come off Cummeragunja and Maloga. So Uncle Doug Nichols and Uncle Jack Patton, Auntie Marge Tucker, Auntie Geraldine Briggs, and then, of course, his brother-in-law, Uncle William Cooper, who I know many in the room would be familiar with his work. His son was Shadrach Livingston James, and I think it's quite well documented that he called for the Aboriginal representation in the federal parliament because he could see the conditions that his people were living in, not only on the missions here but elsewhere as well. And so he wrote an opinion piece to the Sun on April 29, 1929, calling for a federal representative because, he could see that would be a good thing to do, because if you're making policy and whatnot that was to do with Aboriginal people, it would be probably important to include Aboriginal people in that process. So his uncle, Uncle William Cooper, obviously echoed and amplified that call, and I give David a shout out somewhere. He's here. He's a great-grandson of Uncle William, because, that was 1933 that he did that, so 4 years later. But he drew up a petition to the King of England, and he, first of all, sought to get the permissions of the Aboriginal Protection Boards from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, West Australia, because at the time those had sort of governing responsibilities for Aboriginal people on missions. Then from there, he did a lot of, networking with other Aboriginal leaders from across Australia and got the support. I think that signature garnered about 1,814 signatures from memory. So, in those days, quite impressive. Unfortunately, at that time, in the mid-30s, it didn't actually progress past the Prime Minister's office. So he took it back up in his later years in 1937, 1938, I believe, and he again put it on the agenda, and he wrote I think what Professor Bain Atwood describes as his political testament, and he was titled "From an Educated Black," and he again called for Aboriginal representation in the federal parliament, outlined the reasons why. One of the things he was really sort of, keen to outline was the fact that he knew of international examples, like Art has referenced just then. So he drew comparison to the Māori people in New Zealand who had, I think it was called the Maori Parliamentary Act 1867 or something like that. And so he knew that they had more of a say in matters that impacted them. So he was very keen to bring that in, and that was, a teaching from Thomas Shadrach. Why it's important to me, speaking as an individual, I wouldn't speak on behalf of my community or others, but I think this is a mechanism that can lead to some, lasting change. There's a lot of very switched on people that are calling for this, a lot more switched on than myself. And so I think in that instance, I just open my ears and say, well, that would be a good thing to do if we've got people like Auntie Marcia and others that are calling for this. I think if it can go some way to making a difference, I think that'd be a good thing.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and just a reminder to us that this is not something that has just happened in the last few years, but has been something so deeply important to our Indigenous people for a long time, and your family reflect that. If I turn to you, Todd, you've spoken about experiencing the impact of Aboriginal bodies and services being just abolished, the change of government. Can you tell us more why, for you, the voice should it be constitutionally enshrined? After all, some people would say you've got a right to vote. Why should it be constitutionally enshrined?
I grew up in a country town called Condobolin, which is central New South Wales, and made overwhelmingly popular by Shannon Knoll. But nonetheless, we've been around for a while. When I was 6, I clearly remember going up to the canteen with a red slip and 5 cents, and ATSIC covered the rest of my lunch. 3 years later, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission covered the rest. I had no idea what that meant at the time, but I knew that it meant that mum, a single mother who raised 6 kids, meant that her son had food. 3 years later, I no longer could go up to give that red slip, and since then witnessed and observed the slowness of policy that eradicated and made it tougher for my mum to continue to raise her kids. She's a great mother, she raised a commissioner, so the story ends good. But nonetheless, it was the first time that I recognised, mostly in retrospection, how easy it was for the slippage back into disadvantage because of a decision made in Canberra. And that, for me, it sparked an interest in understanding the relationship between my community and the decisions made elsewhere. Now, certainly, since then, I've been, and probably in the last decade, become overwhelmingly biased by studying at the feet of Marcia Langton. But it makes clear sense that an enshrined body allows the continuity of success to emerge. Now, it's no small accident that I came from an overwhelmingly poor, socially and politically isolated community into finishing high school, into university, where I studied at the University of Melbourne at Warman College and eventually completed my PhD under Marcia, and am now here in this position, but moving forward. Those acts of success in my life are because of decisions made in communities where leadership says, no, you will go and do this, you will move, you will finish high school, you will, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't occur overwhelmingly across the nation. There are significant ways in which localised First Nations leaders are disadvantaged or underserved by the political establishment because of no enshrinement in the Constitution or no enshrinement at a state level. Now, a voice to Parliament, in my mind, and an enshrined voice to Parliament, makes sense to then build the capacity and the infrastructure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders to begin overwhelmingly making decisions about their lives and their communities' lives and their children's lives. We know that one-size-blanket-fits-all policies has never worked. What happens and what needs to happen for communities in Broome will look vastly different to what needs to happen here on Gooka's country. And a voice allows us to do that in a sustainable, long-term way.
Well, thank you. Thank you also just for sharing that, your own personal story, and for sharing something of your own heart with us tonight. And also, in the great Jewish tradition, we respect the teacher-student relationship, and having it on display here tonight is also something quite beautiful. So thank you for that. If I sort of open up and ask now a question of all of you, really, of our three panelists. Some people, I may just start with sort of more basic one, some people feel they don't understand the detail. If they don't understand the details, I'm sure we read about it and we hear about it, we don't understand the details of the voice proposal. So that's why we should vote no. And then they say there'll be crippling red tape as well. And what would you say to those people?
This is a book by Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, an incredible acclaimed journalist. The Voice to Parliament Handbook, all the detail you need to know. Also, these amazing devices that everybody has in their pockets are incredible. There's a website called Google. There's voice.gov.au. There is the incredible literature by Langton and others. There are over 700 pages of detail around the construction of a constitutionally enshrined voice. There are overwhelming amounts of scholarship, TikToks, Instagrams, whatever platform you're on, there is detail there or somebody having a conversation. My response to the idea of the question, we need more detail, is rooted in an ignorant framework of laziness. Aboriginal Australia have, in multiple ways, continued to provide to non-Indigenous Australians ample opportunity to understand the truth and our histories. And it happens in various ways, whether it is the Bunjil exhibition at Melbourne Museum or the various museums and collections of books in libraries right across the country. There are multiple projects where archives have been digitised, where opportunities to learn about local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are accessible in the device that sits in your pocket. So the detail in my mind is wrapped up in, or the question of the detail in my mind is wrapped up and is very politicised and errs, and I think Marcia will have a much stronger voice on this one, on the side of racism for me.
Did you want to comment on that, Marcia?
Well, sadly, we're all stuck in a kind of catch-22 situation. So the naysayers can say, we haven't seen the detail. We know they have. We know that it's accessible to them just as it is to anybody else, but it's easy to get away with making that statement because nobody's going to go and look, And when you say, but the detail's there are the two reports that we did, and then they say, well, I'm not going to read 300 pages. So first they say there's no detail and then they don't want to read the detail. But there's a very tricky business going on. Peter Dutton is very well aware of all the detail. What he's doing is baiting the Prime Minister to bring all of that detail to the public's attention so that he can then bait Albanese even more about the detail. And Albanese doesn't want to be dragged, into that fight. So, because he's frightened of, I think, at least two things. One is, you've seen how easy it is for the no case to whip up racism. I mean, I'm sure all of you recognise racism when you see it. And the racism towards us in recent times has skyrocketed because of the no case, because they're dog whistling. So Albanese doesn't want to give more ammunition to that kind of behaviour because, so they've already started, so there's no stopping it, but he's trying to limit it. So one of the things they say, Aborigines already get billions of dollars, where's it all going? Well, you could ask Stuart Robert or Angus Taylor that question, or, maybe it's a good question to go to the new National Corruption Commission, because Aboriginal communities don't see it. The other day, in The Australian, no less, they obviously had to publish something that wasn't entirely supporting the no case, or maybe it was. There's a survey of the Madu communities. Half their houses have to be are only fit to be demolished. Half of them, right? So the Madu don't see the money. Where does the money go? Let me tell you, this is what we want to know. And this is why we want the voice. We want to know where all that money goes. So let me tell you how it works. Where do the billions go? Most of it goes to public servants. They count all the public service wages and costs and, jumping on and off planes and fly-in, fly-out visits to Aboriginal communities. They also have this system called untied grants. They give hundreds of millions of dollars to the state and territory governments to spend on specific Aboriginal matters, but there's no accountability. And there's nothing in law or regulation or policy that says that the states and territories have to spend it on what it's supposed to be spent on. So I know that over in Perth, and there's a case, it's been in the newspapers, it was in the newspapers for years, one public servant stole $50 million that was allocated by the Commonwealth to the Western Australian government for Aboriginal housing. And this is why half the houses in Madu country, in the Western Desert, are only fit to be demolished. The money is disappearing. We don't see most of it. And, and yet the naysayers claim that we're getting billions of dollars and that's why we shouldn't have the voice. No, we should have the voice for budget transparency. This is why we need the voice. So I could point to many other dog whistles, but that's one of them. Then the other problem is that the constitutional purists, and there are some in our community, I won't name names, but you can guess, don't want the detail out there because their constitutional policy position is that Australian voters are voting on the principle of recognition and the voice in the Constitution, and the detail must be worked out in Parliament. Well, it's all very well to be a constitutional purist and say that mantra to Australians who are not constitutional purists. How many constitutional black letter lawyers do we have here tonight? One. Now you know what it's like to feel in the minority. So everybody else says, no, but I still want to know what it would look like. You see? Constitutional black letter law doesn't persuade them. I still want to know what it looks like, they say. And then Peter Dutton keeps asking, but where's the detail, where's the detail? And so you're thinking, well, if he's asking where's the detail, there mustn't be any detail. But as I've explained, there's hundreds of pages of it. So, but our yes case doesn't want to, if you like, rat out the constitutional purists in our community and say, the detail's here, here's the website. That's the catch-22. I have, tonight, I've told you how to find it. Just Google Voice Co-Design Final Report. And if you go to page 16, there's a few pages where it's all summarised. And it's as boring as the Constitution, just heads up.
But it's visualised as well.
No, there are nice diagrams.
And the book has got some nice diagrams and cartoons as well.
Terrific little book.
And so that's the dumbed down version, but this more simple version that I think should be accessible to most people. The devil, in this case, is the detail. The devil is in the detail. I don't know. I want to just ask. How are we going for time? Okay, so let me ask you a question to you, Jamil. Is what tangible changes do you see the voice having on your life and on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders? I think we have Torres Strait Islanders. I think kind of in a way that has been answered, but maybe I don't know if you have got a different kind of reflection on that.
I think it has been covered off. I guess I would reflect on a conversation I was having earlier today with Nawi, Carolyn Briggs, and I'm actually in quite a privileged position and aren't raised that before, and so potentially not as great an impact on my life, but maybe my family members' lives that are sort of not in as strong a position as I, due to the impacts that Todd was talking about before. I think that if we can implement anything that will, I guess, make a difference, it's important to do. Yeah.
Can I add to that? Because I think there's a really important point that Jamil makes, but I want to challenge you on it. It will create for you a channel. I mean, you work in, not to bring your employer into this, but you work at a great institution where you're privileged to be able to see where it is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in general are going in terms of their education, what makes them tick, where it is that they're going. But where do you put all that data? Right? Who do you funnel that into? Right? There is a structure now that potentially can be in place for you to make recommendations to. So while it might not impact your day-to-day life, I think there are important ways in which it impacts all of us, whether we're in a privileged position or not, because it finally gives us avenues in which to make evidence-based recommendations that can be given over to a body that can then refer that on to the government of the day.
So thank you both for that. I think the next question to me has got a rather simple answer, but I'd like to nevertheless pose it to you. People will say, oh, why are some Indigenous people so passionately opposed to the yes vote?
So there are, I think, two broad categories. One is, the kind of people like Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price who, line up with the Liberal Party and the National Party in their no case. And I'm completely at a loss to understand their arguments. I've listened to their arguments. Everything they say is that they're actually arguments for the voice. They say we need practical measures. Well, that's what the voice will advise on. But clearly they've been captured by a particular kind of politic, and they feel that they have a niche there and that they have good careers in that particular niche. But they're two people. There are almost 1 million of us now, and those two people do not represent us. Then, just by the by, there's another argument that you often see. Well, you've got members of parliament, you've got senators, why do you need anything else? Well, because they are not in parliament to represent us as peoples. They're in parliament to represent their electorates. And they could lose the election the next time around. And, while we have 11 at the moment, at the next election we might have none. So there is no guarantee that our interests will ever be represented in Parliament. by any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander representative in a parliament. They're there to represent their electorates, and they may not be there at the next election. We want an enshrined voice to Parliament to give advice and to be the form of our recognition that a hostile government can't take away, that a hostile electorate can't take away from us. However, the voice will be, a mere statement in the Constitution. Just as the Constitution says there shall be a High Court. The detail of it is worked out elsewhere in legislation. If we win this referendum, and we're all a bit worried about that at the moment, if we win this referendum, the Constitution will have a new chapter which will say there shall be a voice and will make representations and to the Parliament and the executive government, and there's a couple more lines. It's about half a paragraph. All the detail will be worked out in Parliament, and that is where our report will be debated. So if we have a permanent voice enshrined in the Constitution, it can't be taken away by a government in the future. It can't be taken away by the electorate, and it is there to make representations on matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the other group of naysayers, so I think represented by Senator Lydia Thorpe and her so-called black sovereignty movement. Well, again, I'm at a loss to explain their point of view. You see the mention in the Uluru Statement from the Heart about sovereignty. And this, I think, is... Can you find that page for me, please, Todd?
Beginning.
So our version of sovereignty is that it is... This sovereignty, that is, this magical concept of sovereignty, is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. I think you all have a very good idea of what that means. That is not what Senator Thorpe means by sovereignty. She does not mean what the Uluru Statement from the Heart means, which is very sad, because every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person who supports the voice knows exactly what that means. We have our Aboriginal ancestors, and my white ancestors don't recognise me. So, people might say, like Andrew Bolt does, but you don't look Aboriginal. Well, no, but my white ancestors don't exist. I don't exist for them and they don't exist for me. I only have Aboriginal ancestors. So I do want to be buried on my country. I'm trying to work out how to make that happen. But even if I'm not, my soul will go to a place that I know. And that's why we go back to these places, to be, in the presence of our ancestors. That's what that means. What does Senator Thorpe mean by it? What do her followers mean? They seem to think that there is some idea of a black sovereignty that's going to fall out of the sky and give us this enormous power. It's magical thinking. It's never going to happen. We have to extricate from the political system small measure after small measure so to counter that tendency of the political system to constantly marginalise us. And we're asking for the bare minimum, the right to be recognised and give advice. So no, it's not sovereignty, but what it does do is give all of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture to have a say about how their cultures can be preserved, how their important places can be preserved, and how they can pass this knowledge on to their children so that our societies and cultures and beliefs have a future, so that our younger generations have a future knowing that they are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Mm-hmm. But what Lydia thought means, I can't tell you. Mm.
Just to add to that, I actually think the no sentiment's been conflated a little bit as well. Art quoted the figures before. It's actually around 85% of First Nations people that support a voice to Parliament. And I think, it's part of the smokescreen that's been set up around sort of trying to interfere with the vote. We've referenced Peter Dutton a few times today, and Art spoke before about the impact of the apology to the stolen generations. Well, Peter Dutton didn't really show the respect to that. He walked out during it, which a lot of people will probably remember, and was a minister in a government that had a Prime Minister that said that he didn't subscribe to the black armband version of history. So be very careful about getting my guidance from someone like that.
And I'm not being politically partisan, because there are Liberal Party members of Parliament and senators who agree with me. I'm talking about one person and his beliefs, and clearly he's appealing to that 22% of the Australian population who are deeply racist and for some reason irrationally hate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But the same cannot be said of Andrew Bragg or Julian Lisa or, so many other members of the Liberal Party. I believe there's about 40% of the Liberal Party who agree with us and have over many decades worked with us to get to this point. So I'm not being politically partisan. And I'm not saying that Peter Dutton is a racist, and I'm not insulting anybody. I'm just pointing out what they are saying and providing a critique of it. They're wrong. They're just plain wrong.
Thank you for that, Marcia. We have to start, we're really just tying up the evening now, and just so maybe as one final part of the evening, ask you all just maybe very briefly, if you want to leave our audience with one takeaway as to why the referendum is so crucial. I think you've expressed it beautifully and have articulated it, but perhaps if there is anything else that you would want to say as a short, brief takeaway statement to our audience, what would it be?
I'm happy to start with that. I guess Art mentioned before that we're between 3 and 4% of the population. So whether all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people vote yes or vote no, it's not actually going to make a difference. So it's actually up to the rest of Australia to, get it over the line for us. I think there's been a little bit of a smokescreen, like I said before, a little bit of confusion, but this is something that we want. We think it can make a difference. So, use your spheres of influence to get the message out there. That's something that we do want. Yeah.
I'll go on and you can have the final word. For me, I want to talk about the yes camp in my closing right. I see 2 yes camps. One yes camp, which is people who firmly believe in their bones that Aboriginal people should have agency over their own lives. Firmly believe it. And then there's a yes camp that will vote yes because of the guilt and shame. Unfortunately, that yes camp will always question the decisions that will be made by the voice moving forward. And that's fine, a yes is a yes, and we'll accept it and we'll take it. But I think you all know somebody who might vote yes based on that guilt and that shame. And if you firmly believe the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have self-determination and can have agency over their own lives, sit in your kitchen tables with those people and those if there are no's in their family as well, and communicate, break bread, have a discussion, this campaign at a community level will happen in the kitchen tables. And we've all sat at those kitchen tables and had that discussion before, but now is more important than ever for those discussions to occur. Thank you.
I would like you to read section 25 of the Australian Constitution. It's called the race power. It used to read before the referendum of 1967 a bit differently, but in any case, it's the power under in the chapter that gives the Parliament its lawmaking powers. So basically, it says that the Parliament shall have the power to make laws for the people of any race. However, the only race that it's been used against is the imaginary Aboriginal race. Now, it used to say the Parliament shall have power to make laws except for Aborigines. So that was changed, but now it's for any race. So in conjunction with the external power, when it was used in the Northern Territory emergency intervention laws, it is actually a racist clause in our Constitution. And it is deliberately called the race power because the Parliament can use it because of the Cartinery case in the High Court to cause us detriment. So it's a very odd history that has forced us into the position where successive Prime Ministers have said, well, Australians will never vote to remove Section 25 of the Constitution so that our Constitution is free of racism. That was the view of Tony Abbott. It was the view of Bill Shorten. It was the view of Malcolm Turnbull. It was the view of Morrison. So Noel Pearson went away and wrote an essay called Our Rightful Place, where he proposes that the voice be a constitutional hook to ameliorate that racism in the Constitution, to give Aboriginal people a way of giving advice to stop or at least to advise on any racist proposal. And we can expect more racist proposals from Canberra because we've seen many of them in the last 10 years, and parliamentarians can't even tell you why they did it. But they don't even understand the logic of it, but, you know, it just somehow magically emerges from the parliamentary system because there are no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices to tell them, no, don't do that, it's racist. No, don't do that, it will harm us, it will cause us detriment. But the Constitution, in conjunction with the Cartinery case in the High Court and the external affairs power, enables our Parliament to cause us harm as a race. But we are not a race. We are peoples. And I know that you know what I mean. You've lived with racism. You've lived with anti-Semitism. You're not a race. You're a people. We are peoples. He's Wiradjuri. I'm Yaman. You're Yorta Yorta. We're peoples. So I want you to keep that in mind. And that's my, personal appeal to you, to understand who we are. And we want Australia to be a multicultural nation because it's our best chance of survival. I was born in 1951. I know what it's like to live under a quasi-colonial regime. I grew up in Queensland. I love multicultural Australia, and what a wonderful place it is compared to the 1950s in Queensland. I grew up under racist legislation in Queensland, and it was the Commonwealth government that prohibited racism with the Racial Discrimination Act. We need the Racial Discrimination Act to work. We need Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be able to say to the Parliament, do not suspend the Racial Discrimination Act for racist reasons. Don't do that. So that's my personal appeal to you. Give us that opportunity.
I think you will all agree that we've really been privileged tonight to hear voices of reason and voices that come from the heart. And I hope that, and I think your words really would resonate, I think, with most people in this audience, if not with everybody over here, for we understand so well what you're talking about in terms of that discrimination, that racism, and in terms of being people and a nation. I think we are people who have had our dreams for thousands of years, and I like to think that this is an opportunity for us, people who have had Ayinuka Cholmim, for us dream people to meet the people of the dream time, to say no to the nightmare and say yes to the dream. There's a space that is here now that is opening up, and I hope we will join together with you, where we, the people of a long dream, can meet the people of this enduring dreaming. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Hannah Hammerschlag, the campaign manager of Kol Halev. This is Mickey Fisher, our campaign chair. On behalf of Stand Up and our foundational partner, the JCCV, we really are both honoured to be walking and talking alongside this panel of incredible speakers and with you, our wonderful Jewish community of Melbourne. What stood out to me tonight was that the Voice to Parliament is a generous offer and a genuine request from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to move forward as one collaborative Australia. As Jamil said, over 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are in support of the Voice, but they're only 3 to 4% of the population. They can't do it alone. We have the power to influence the people around us. We have the power to share the messages that most resonated with us tonight. And we all have the power to encourage others to listen more broadly and with an open heart. To our guest speakers tonight and to Professor Carolyn Briggs, thank you for the effort and sensitivity and patience it takes to share your voices around these issues. We know that you and your families have been working on First Nations justice now for decades, and we applaud your efforts and hope to continue being allies to you and your communities for decades to come. Please accept a small token of our thanks and appreciation, and everyone please join me in one more big round of applause. So we've now heard from these three amazing voices and also heard about the Jewish imperative from Rabbi Ralph. Now is the time to act. I'm conscious of time, and with our final few minutes, I would like to share quickly some ways that you and your communities can get further involved in Kol Halev. Firstly, for any communal organisations, shuls, aged care homes, schools, youth movements, other Jewish roof bodies and businesses, as Todd said, we would love to help you have conversations around the Voice directly with your congregants, members and other stakeholders. We know that different events suit different communal organisations, and we want to offer an opportunity for all community members to engage with issues around the Voice. within the safety and comfort of your own networks. Please come and chat to me after the event or shoot us an email up on stage. And while we're on the chatting theme, some of our partner organisations are also doing amazing things in the voice space. Plus 61J with their Shabbat table talks, August with Youth for Yes, and B'nai B'rith's Reconciliation Action Group. Some of them are here tonight, so please go and hear what they're doing and support them where you can. So that's phase one of our engagement activities that are available to the community through Kol Halev. It's our community organising phase, and I'll now hand over to Mickey to briefly share a little bit about phase two activities.
So we're at the end of the event tonight, but we're really kicking off with Kol Halev. And Jamil talked about the smoke screen that people are trying to put together. And I guess what we want you to think about is really what Marcia Langton asked at the very beginning of some of her comments, which is, that after the referendum, did you do enough? Did you do your bit? And we have an enormous opportunity as a community to do our bit and to move others to action as well. And we want to do what can cut through the smoke screen. And at the end of the day, that's conversations. That's conversations at your dinner table, but it's also conversations out in the community. And so what Yes 23 are doing, which is the national campaigning organisation, is they're mobilising a massive volunteer army to, in a few weeks' time, be moving out there, talking on the streets, having conversations at people's doors, phone calls, really working, conversations. Everyone can do it. Everyone can do it. If you don't have time, you might have something else, you might have some money. Everyone can give money as well. So we just want to kind of point out a couple of people that are running around with clipboards tonight, very fun people at the back over there with some clipboards. Sign up. Because in the Jewish community through Kol Halev, the way we can capitalise on this opportunity is by recruiting and mobilising a very significant campaigning group to uplift and elevate what Yes 23 is doing. And so that's kind of what we really want to get you thinking about, which is, well, what can I do? Can I give my time or can I give my money? Whatever you can do, find someone with a clipboard at the back and put your name down.
So finally, just one final vote of thanks for our wonderful panel and our moderator, to Professor Carolyn Briggs, Professor Marcia Langton, Jamil Tai, Dr. Todd Fernando and Rabbi Ralph. Thank you very much for giving your time and effort to teach us.